This is called the Burin color triangle, and it is a way through which you can achieve beautiful color harmony. There are but 7 forms of color which are shown here, and they are white, gray, black, shade, color, tint, and tone. And 3 of these are of primary importance, and they are the ones that have larger circles. So it's the white, black, and color that are of primary importance. 4 are of secondary importance: tint, tone, gray, and shade. Each of these components of the color triangle is different. None of these resemble each other. Each is quite different. White is different from a tint, and tint is different from a color, and color is different from a shade, and so on. If you've been struggling to achieve beautiful color harmony in your paintings, well, if you use this color triangle, then it's going to be very easy to create beautiful harmony of color. Using this triangle is the key to great color harmony. But you need to know how to use it. When you arrange color in the sequence presented by the Burin color triangle, there is to be found beauty and harmony. So a sequence would be like this: from white to tone to shade, or from tint to tone to black, or from gray to tone to color, or from white to tint to color, or color, shade, and black, or white, gray, and black. If you follow those sequences, you'll end up with harmonious relationships and beauty. Where a color sequence follows a straight path on the Burin color triangle, the eye seems to be pleased. Pure colors go well with tints on a white ground. So let me establish a white ground, and then I'll add a pure color, let's say a red. And then I'll add a tint of that red. So that's this sequence here. And let me enlarge that white ground, or field as it's also referred to, a white field. And you can see that the relationship of colors here is rather pleasing looking. And I think I'll do another arrangement in which the colors go well together. This time I'll add a black ground. And then against the black ground, or this black field, I'll add, let's say, a shade. And I'll make it this red-violet, a shade of red-violet. And as you know, a shade is a result of adding black to a color. And by going to the color picker and selecting this color here, black has been added to this pure red-violet color. So by moving that little circle over in the direction of where the grays are located here and the black, I'm adding black to that pure red-violet color, and thereby making it a shade of red-violet, which I've just added here. But then I also add a pure color and a pure red-violet. And you can see how pleasing this relationship of colors appears to be, because it follows this sequence here: color, shade, and black. And now I'll use this sequence here: color, tone, gray. Pure color and tone look rather well against a neutral gray background. So I'm going to select a true neutral from the color picker, and that will be my background, or the field against which pure color and a tone is going to be seen. And tone, as defined by the Barin color triangle, is a grade color. So I'm going to select a color, and I think I'll use an orange color and gray that orange color a bit, like this, and add that to my field or background. And then I'll add a pure orange color, a highly saturated orange, like this. And you can see that this combination or arrangement looks rather pleasing to the eye. And that's because I followed this sequence on the Barin color triangle. But you could even follow a sequence like this that isn't on a straight line and end up with a rather pleasing appearance of color. So let's say I add a shade, and I'll add a shade of blue, which means I have to add black to that color. And you can see that that is not a neutral or a true neutral. You can still see some of that color, some of that blue color, and against that I'll place a tone, which means that there's less black in that color. It's a grade blue, or I could even change it to a blue-violet like that, and have a grade blue-violet, and place that against the shade of blue, and then a tint of that blue-violet, or I could add a tint of red-violet like this. It doesn't have to be the same color, as long as the colors are closely related. They'll make a pleasing arrangement. Beauty of color is found in these kind of sequences of the Barin color triangle. Now here's a rough black and white sketch that I did. Let's say I want to use the Barin color triangle here, and I have to think about which sequence is going to work for this particular picture. Is it this tint tone black? Is it color shade black? Which one's going to work best? And right now I'm thinking maybe this one down here, but I can't be sure. I have to do a quick color sketch and see how that's going to work. So I'm going to pick up this shade right there. That background color is a shade, and I'll apply it to the background here like this, just really rough. Now for the tone, which is this, I can make darker tones, lighter tones. So I think I'm going to pick up that color and then go to the color picker and then make a darker tone, something like this, and even darker. So I'm replacing that black with this dark tone, blue-violet tone. Now it can be different colors. It doesn't have to be the same color. You can have closely related colors. You don't just use one color like you see in all of these examples here. One color that is pure, like this, one color that is a tone, and then the black. You can have different pure colors or different color tones. So I'm going to now add a tint, and I think I'll add a tint right there. I picked up this color here, which is a tint of this blue-violet. There are different degrees of tints. There are tints that look almost white, and then there are tints that are like this, where there's more color to be seen, or tints that have a lot of white in them like that. So there are different degrees. And I think I'll use this tint here. And tinting a color reduces its saturation. And it also cools the color because you're adding white. White is a cool color, so when you add white to a color, it will cool it. So here's this tint, and then I'll add it over here too, but I need to warm it up a little bit by adding a little red to it, which makes it lean a bit more toward the red-violet, something like this, see? It's a little bit more red in there. It's a little warmer. Now, even though I'm using different shades, I'm still remaining within this sequence here. Shade, tone, and tint. And as you can see, it's not along a straight line. It doesn't have to be. You still get beautiful color relationships by following sequences that are not along a straight line. I can use all sorts of different colors of shades and different colors of tone and different colors of tint and remain within this sequence that I selected. And then you can, of course, go beyond that sequence by adding certain accents, like maybe white, for example, or a pure color that you want to add, or maybe just a neutral gray, or even some black. But this is the main sequence that I'm following. So you have a main sequence, and then you can select color forms outside of that sequence, as I just pointed out to you. Now I think I'm going to add more tone, but it doesn't have to be these same colors that I've been using. For his face, I'll use an orange color, but it will be a tone because it is being grayed. The orange is being grayed. Maybe something like this. See what it looks like. And make it a little lighter, like this. Now this is very rough, as you can see. Now in some spots, there's going to be shade. So I would have a shade of that orange. And I add a little more red to the orange, because there's a color change that takes place as the color moves into shadow, that you'll be learning about later on. So I can have tone and shade together here. The darker parts are where the shade occurs. Those parts that are lighter are where the tone is being applied. And now I'll add a tint of the orange, leaning a bit more toward the yellow-orange. See, white is being added to this orange color, so I'm tinting the orange, and thereby I'm using tint that you see here on the Barin color triangle. It's part of this sequence here. And I'll add that over here to where his nose is being hit by the light right there, and also on his mustache. And I can make that lighter. So I add a lighter tint. See, different tints can be added. But they're all part of this idea of following a sequence with a lot of different tints, a lot of different tones, and a lot of different shades. Not just one shade, one tone, or one tint. Now I think I'll add some more tints of this yellow-orange to his mustache and to his nose here. Maybe an even lighter tint of that yellow-orange. It's actually a little more toward the orange. So I'm going to raise this color bar a little bit so that more of the yellow is being added to that orange color, and maybe make it a bit more of a tint. And then I'll add that over here to his nose, and maybe a little bit to his mustache. So I have different degrees of tints here where the light is falling. And I can have different degrees of tints in other parts of this picture as well. So I think I'm going to darken this part a bit more. It's attracting too much attention away from the face. I think that's better. And now I'll add a darker shade right there. Pick up that color and darken it. Maybe something like that. Soften the edge of his clothing here. Harder brush, I think, would work better. And even darker. Keeps the eye from leaving the picture right there at the corner. This dark. And that line like this stops here. Otherwise, if that dark wasn't there, the eye would continue down like that. Make the line a bit more rhythmic, like this. More curving. More interesting. Now I'll repeat some of that color in the background in the side of his face here, relating his face better to the background, and maybe a little of that violet color also in some parts of his face, like this violet that you see right there. Now this is very rough, as you can see. I'm not spending too much time on this. And then some of that violet color can also be repeated in the background over here, tying various parts of the picture together to this repetition of color. And then I can add a darker shade of, let's say, red-orange, like this, for his beard. And then add a little bit of light falling on his beard. And I need to add a color right here where his lip is. So go to the color picker, select the color, and it's a tone, but you can have a tone that is a tint also, which means that the tone is a grayed color, but you're adding white to that grayed color, thereby you're tinting that grayed color. And that's what I'm doing here with the color picker. So I'm adding that to his lip. Now, according to the Barin color triangle here, a tone is arrived at, or one of the ways, by mixing a color and a neutral gray. Now, when you're using the computer and the color picker, as I mentioned earlier, when you're graying a color, you're actually adding black to it. But in the color picker, let's say that I want to gray this red here. Now, you might say, well, I'm not adding black, I'm adding gray because this is where the gray is, right here on the left side, and at that same level, if I move the circle over, I'm graying that red by adding this neutral gray to it. Well, in fact, you're adding black because a neutral gray is a mixture of white and black. So in effect, you're really adding black as well. You're adding white and black, which results in that gray, and that gray is being added to that color, thereby graying it, and the result is a tone. But in fact, as I mentioned, you're also adding black to that color to gray it. Now, what I could go is outside of this sequence, like I mentioned before, and add a white. Now, it doesn't have to be a pure white, as long as it looks like a white within the picture. So it's going to be an off-white. Usually, you're not going to use a pure white. So I'll add the white maybe over here, like this, to his beard. Part of his beard is white. And I think that's about it. And maybe his eye, this one or maybe that one. Let's see, just a hint of white, like that. See, this, even though this is not a pure white, it reads as a white. So I made a slight adjustment here, and that's about it. Now let's try a different sequence on the Burin color triangle. I just added a color to his lip here, so it looks a bit reddish. And now for a different sequence. I think the sequence that I'm going to use is this one, color tone gray. And I'm going to add, I think, a bright red, leaning a bit toward the red-violet, just a little bit, to the background here. And as you can see, it's a bright red. Since I'm using color, which is one of the forms of color along this sequence, I'm using a color that is more pure or brighter, because the Burin color triangle, when it talks about color, is referring to more saturated color as compared to other colors within the painting. Now, a tone, and that tone could be his face. So I'll add, let's say, a red, again, that leans a little toward the red-violet, but since it's a tone, I need to add gray to it. And right around here on the left side, you see gray, so if I move the little circle over toward the color, it's being grayed or reduced in its saturation by that gray, that neutral gray. But again, like I mentioned earlier, that's because there is black within that gray, and it's the black that is reducing the intensity of that color. So maybe something like this. No, that's no good. Try this. That's better. And his beard, I'll probably leave the way it is. Or maybe I could add a little bit of red here instead of the white. Could add some red like this. So that red is a tone because it's a grayed red. And then I'll add gray. Now, I could use a true neutral gray, which is, as you know, a mixture of white and black. Or I could have a gray that has just a little bit of color within it so that it doesn't look so dead and dull. So what I would do is go to the color picker, select a gray on the left side here, and then move the little circle over a little so that just a little bit of color is added to that gray. It's still a gray, but it's a gray that looks a bit more lively because of that little bit of color within it. So it's not so dead looking. But it's not going to be a red. Let's say maybe a blue, something like this maybe. Let's see what that looks like. So it's a neutral gray with just a little bit of that blue within it, but unfortunately it's too light, so I have to darken it. And by darkening it, what's happening now is that it's actually becoming, so I'm darkening it like this, really dark neutral gray, like this. And I think I have to go even darker. And then right over here, I need to add a lighter gray. The light is striking that part of the clothing, so it's lighter. And then right here as well. soften this edge, darken this corner here, keep the eye from leaving the picture at that corner. And then add a little bit of that color in the background to his face right here where his cheek is. And adding a little bit of that color to that neutral gray like this as well. Some reflected light from the background is coloring that gray, adding some color to it. Now again, I'll go outside of the main sequence by selecting white and then also tint. And I think I'll add that white back where it was, right over here. And then right there, I'll add a tint of red, like this, leaning a bit toward the yellow-orange, or rather orange, because it's in the light. Let's see, something like this maybe, to get the right color. You can see that white is being added, so therefore it's a tint, but it's not right yet. Maybe darker, something like that. Now it becomes more of a tone. Let's see what that looks like. I think that's better. Yeah, something like that. So you can go outside the sequence. You can use whatever other forms of color that you need to complete your painting. This gray right here, the neutral gray that is receiving some light, needs to be warmed up a little bit, so I'll select that and go to the color picker and then warm it up by adding some orange color to it, like that. Let's see what that looks like. You see there's like a hint of color within that neutral gray. But I think it needs to be a different color. So let's try this red. I think that works better. It looks warmer. So maybe something like that. And then I'll put a frame around it, a heavy frame, like this. And I think that's about as far as I'm going to take this little rough color sketch. So I've given you a couple examples in which I've followed a sequence of color from the Berlin color triangle and then added additional forms of color whenever I needed to. And this is a good way to work to arrive at a beautiful and harmonious color. It's believed that some of the greatest artists of all time followed certain sequences according to this Berlin color triangle, but of course they didn't know anything about this Berlin color triangle at the time. But when their paintings are studied, certain sequences of color seem to have been followed. For example, Rembrandt is said to have used this sequence: color, shade, and black. And then, of course, with additional forms of color, whichever ones he needed to add to that sequence to finish his painting with. Now, the great Goya supposedly used this sequence of color: white, tone, and shade, while the great Leonardo da Vinci used this sequence: tint, tone, shade. And again, with additional forms of color added whenever he needed additional forms to add to his main sequence. While a neutral gray is mixed by using white and black, such as this, and I add a little bit of white, and I have a neutral gray. Now that's just one way to mix a neutral gray, and this kind of neutral gray looks rather dead and lifeless. There are other ways to mix neutral grays, such as when using the three primary colors, which are red, yellow, and blue. When you mix them together, you get, theoretically, a neutral gray. However, usually there's always like a slight tinge of a color that can be seen unless you can get the proportions of the mixtures just right, and that's very difficult to do. Now, Photoshop doesn't do a very good job of mixing these colors together. I would have to use the smudge tool, for example, to mix them together, and the result is not very good. However, if you're using a software like Painter 12, you can mix the colors together to get a neutral gray, but the best way is with paint. So if you're using paint, you can try this to get a neutral gray that looks more lively than one that is mixed using white and black. In addition, you can also get a neutral gray by mixing the complementary colors together, such as, for example, violet and yellow. So here again, I can't really mix them very well in Photoshop, but if you're using Paint or Painter 12, you can mix them together to get a neutral gray. Here I am in Painter 12, and I'll be able to show you how you can mix these colors together that I've been talking about to form neutral grays, which I'm not able to do in Photoshop. So here, in what is called the mixer, I'm going to mix these colors, starting with red. So I'll just add a little bit of red, and also the complement to red, green, and then I'll add white, and mix these together, and there you see a neutral gray, or anyway, as close as you can get to a neutral gray when mixing complementary colors together. Now, I'll mix the primary colors together. I'll start off with white, and then I'll add red and blue and yellow. So mixing them together will also produce a neutral gray. But again, you need to get the right proportions of the mixture. So there you have it. That's about as close as I'll get to a true neutral gray that looks like a mixture of just white and black. Since these neutral grays that result from these kind of mixtures still have a slight tinge of a color within them usually, these kind of neutral grays are preferred because they have a livelier appearance to them than the mixture of just black and white like this. See, when you compare the two grays, I think you can see that this mixture here, the one that I did with the three primaries, looks like it has a little bit of color within it, just a tinge of color. While this other one with black and white just looks dead. And now I'm going to go back to Photoshop. And now I'm back in Photoshop. I want to talk about tone. Tone is arrived at in all sorts of different ways through various mixtures of the 7 forms of color. The 3 main or primary forms of color that you see here in large circles, when mixed together, form a tone. So I'll select a color, let's say red, and I'll add it over here. And then I'll select black and add that to the red. And then I'll add white to the mixture. And what I end up with is what the Barin color triangle refers to as tone. Now, in addition to arriving at tones by mixing white, black, and color, there's also an additional way through which tones can be mixed, which I'm going to show you now. You see these lines here extending out from tone, and that gives you the answer. By mixing tint and black, for example, along this sequence here, you get tone. Or by mixing white and a shade together, you get a tone. By mixing a color and a gray, which is a neutral gray, with each other, you get a tone. So to arrive at a tone is done by way of all of these other forms of color when they're mixed together along the sequence presented in the triangle. I'm going to mix a tone using this sequence here, tint, tone, black, which means that I need to mix together a tint and black to produce a tone. So I'll start off by selecting a color, and let's say this orange color here. Now I need to turn that into a tint, which means I need to add some white to it like this. So now I have this tint of the orange color, and I need to add some black to it now. A little bit of black, not too much, something like this maybe. And the result is a tone. And now I'm going to mix a tone along this sequence, which means mixing a neutral gray with a color. So I'll go to the color picker, and I think I'll select green, add that over here. And now I need to mix a gray, which is going to be a neutral gray, so I'll add some black over here. And then to the black, I'll add a little bit of white to give me a neutral gray. And then I'll pick that up and apply it to the green. And there's my tone. Now I can mix a tone by using this sequence, white, tone, and shade. So I need to mix white and a shade of color together to get the tone. So I'll start off with white, and then I need to add a shade, and the shade is produced by mixing a color and black, as I mentioned before. So I need to select a color, and let's say this red violet here. And now I need to add black to that red violet to produce a shade like this. And now I add that shade to the white. And there's my tone. You can see the difference between a shade and a tone. The tone is lighter in value and has less black in it because of the white that has been added here. Shade has more black in it. But there are also tints of a shade. So you can have lighter shades or darker shades, just as you can have lighter tones and darker tones. Now that I've shown you how you can arrive at a tone as well as a shade, I need to point out another way through which you can get tones and shades. The way that I've shown you so far will result in tones that look rather dull or muddy, and shades that look rather dull or muddy. In order to avoid that, artists usually don't use black and color to arrive at a shade, or let's say color and a neutral gray, which this represents, to arrive at a tone. Artists usually use complementary colors or near complementary colors to arrive at a tone. And they also use complementary or near complementary colors to arrive at shades instead of using black with a color to get a richer looking shade. Shades are usually thought of more as deeper, darker colors, such as this darker blue, for example. You can, of course, have different shades, which means, for example, if I add some white to this darker blue, darker shade of blue, I get a lighter shade of blue. And if I add more white to this shade of blue, I get yet another shade of blue, and so on. So there can be different shades of blue. And a tone is usually thought of in terms of a lighter value. There are, of course, dark tones as well. But the idea is that if you add black to a color, it's shade. And if you add a gray, which means a neutral gray, such as this arrived at through a mixture of white and black, you add that gray to a color and you get a tone. So I add this gray to this color and I get a tone. So that's basically the difference between a tone and a shade. The thing is, however, it can get rather confusing trying to differentiate between a tone and a shade according to this Barin color triangle. A tone can look like a shade, and a shade can look like a tone. So I'm not sure how helpful this really is. I can see why they added tone and shade to this color triangle. It's to differentiate mixtures in which black has been added from mixtures in which a neutral gray has been added, like I pointed out to you over here. But the end result of the mixtures can look so similar that you can't really tell the difference between a tone and a shade. For the sake of clarity and to stick to this Barin triangle as much as possible, I'm going to define a shade as being a color that falls below this diagonal line on the color picker, which means darker, deeper colors. Colors that have a lower value, a darker value to them. While tone are colors that fall along this diagonal and above it, which means colors that have a lighter value, a middle value, or a lighter than middle value. Now, when I talked about tone as it relates to the Barin color triangle, I was talking about mixtures that create certain colors, certain muted or grayed colors. But you also need to think of tone in terms of values, such as you find on a value scale, for example. Each of these values is a tone. When you're painting a picture, you're painting with varying degrees of tone. In other words, different values. Lighter values, darker values, or lighter tones and darker tones. Values and tones essentially mean the same thing. So you need to think of what is the value of the tone that you're mixing. Is it a lighter value? Is it a middle value? Is it a dark value? Now, even though you might be working in Photoshop to paint your pictures with instead of paint and a brush, having an understanding of these 7 basic forms and applying them to your color in addition to the 4 dimensions of color that I'm going to talk about later on in the video, this knowledge and understanding will enable you to know what you're doing when you're going to the color picker and selecting a color. When I'm moving my little circle here into this area, I'll know that I'm selecting a tone here, or a muted color, or a grade color. And down here, I'll know that I'm selecting a shade. Up here, I'll know that I'm selecting a tint, and there are different degrees of tint, lighter tints and darker tints, and so forth. So you won't be working in the dark. You'll know what to do, and you'll know how to combine these 7 forms of color, as well as the 4 dimensions of color that I mentioned, that I'll be talking about later on, which will enable you to create really great looking color. If you're working with actual paint and brushes to paint your pictures with instead of software such as Photoshop, this knowledge will become indispensable, along with a knowledge of the 4 dimensions of color that you also need to know about and understand and apply. It's important that you know about these 7 forms of color, because you're going to be working with them all the time when you're working with color. So knowing them and understanding that when you follow sequences like this, according to this triangle, you're going to end up with harmonious relationships of color. And now I want to show you how you can mix tones and shades without using a neutral gray to mix a tone or black to mix a shade, so that you can get richer looking color. And this is the method that is used by most artists to get richer looking color.